The United States quite literally muscled its way onto the world stage with the Spanish American War and with attempting to strong arm the powers that were carving up China through its open door policy there. Let's look first at the Spanish American War in 1898. We all know a fair amount about the Spanish American War. We know that Americans had been interested in Cuba since the 1830s, 1840s. That interest had died off until tales of suppression of the population arrived in the U.S. in the late 1890s, which fomented a great deal of anger, as well as gave an excuse to those who lusted after bringing Cuba into the what you might call American fold. We tended to support the rebels against the Spanish. This was what led to the rounding up of civilians and placing them into concentration camps, the first known use of concentration camps in the Western world, although the British were using them in Africa at about the same time. General Weyler rounded up civilians, forced them into camps in order to deny Cuban liberation rebels the support of the people, but the conditions were extremely poor in the camps, and Weyler was unable to care for the people that he forced into the camps, and this led to a great deal of illness, death, so much so that it's widely considered to be something of a war crime. Anyway, eventually the United States got into this fight after a particular uprising. The battleship Maine sailed into Havana Harbor. It exploded through causes that we now believe to be internal to the ship, not an attack upon the ship. Nevertheless, the yellow press of the time, which was a big battle between the Hearst newspapers and the Pulitzer newspapers, ginned up a casus belli, a cause for war. And we decided we would go to war after McKinley attempted to avoid war for a number of months. We finally declared war against Spain in April of 1898. Now, we had a lot of difficulty getting troops down to Cuba in support of the rebellion. We finally were able to invade Cuba, and so we invaded on the southeastern edge of Cuba near Santiago, and probably the most famous regiment was, of course, Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, the first volunteer U.S. cavalry made up of what at the time people called swells, swell people, people with lots of money, guys with tons of dough who hung out with Theodore Roosevelt. They made up the first U.S. volunteer cavalry. They charged up San Juan Hill in a feat of both bravery and insanity, supported by Buffalo Soldiers, also known as by regiments that were entitled Immunes. These were black soldiers who were sent to Cuba specifically because it was believed they were immune to certain tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever. And so the I believe it was the 10th Cavalry supported the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, and the 10th was a black unit, of course. Anyway, so we eventually got the Spanish to sue for peace after taking Santiago, and eventually this war was over. Now, the war also took place in a place that we didn't really want to fight, and that was the Philippines. Commodore Dewey had been alerted to move his fleet from Canton into Manila Bay if war was declared. When war was declared in April, he set sail, arriving on May 1st, and doing battle with the Spanish fleet, catching the Spanish fleet unawares and doing battle, just quote unquote doing battle. There was no battle. It was a shooting. It was a turkey shoot. And Dewey sank a number of Spanish ships in the harbor after sinking one Spanish battleship in the mouth of the harbor so that no other ships could escape. He just plucked them off one by one. This was pretty much the end of the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. But in 1898, having arranged to work with the Filipinos under Emilio Aguinaldo, who was widely considered to be the leader of the rebellion in the Philippines against the Spanish, we reneged on a number of our deals, and instead of turning the reins of government over to the Filipinos under Aguinaldo, we retained those reins of government. Aguinaldo and his supporters led an insurrection against the United States that lasted from about 1898 till 1903, and was a very ugly little war. Whereas Theodore Roosevelt had called Cuba a splendid little war, no one called the Philippines a splendid war. It was brutal and ugly. It was guerrilla warfare, occupation, racial hatred, religious hatred, because some of the most tough resistance came from the Moro, who were Muslim. And this was just doubly problematic for the American troops, who were really very, very much displeased with these people as people. And so they were particularly brutal. But the Moro were particularly brutal as well. So this was just an ugly little war. Eventually, however, we settled. We finally suppressed the Philippine insurrection. We settled with Spain, and we paid them $200 million for Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And we settled the arrangement, particularly with Cuba, via the Platt Amendment, which was an amendment to the 1901 budget bill, the Appropriations Act of 1901, introduced by Platt as a writer, had nothing to do with the budget. But what it did was to keep Cuba as a subject territory of the United States. The Platt Amendment bypassed American precedent for absorbing territory and creating territories that were on their way to statehood. There was never any chance of Cuba attaining statehood, in large part because of the Cuban African population that Americans North and South, white Americans, did not want to incorporate into the body politic of the United States. So the precedent since the 1780s from the Northwest Territories Act had been to take in territory, put it on the road to statehood, and have it jump through certain hoops to get to statehood. But there was never any chance of statehood for Cuba, at least between 1901, when the Platt Amendment came into effect, until 1934, when we turned loose of Cuba. So this is a 20th century mechanism, this business of taking in territories and not putting them on the road to statehood. We still, today, maintain Puerto Rico as a territory. And though some people in Puerto Rico want to become a state, others want to become independent, and then a third, potentially largest group, wants to retain territorial status. So this is not something that's likely to be resolved anytime in the very near future. But nevertheless, let's look at some images here. You can see Commodore Dewey off on the left, a photo of Aguinaldo, a photo of Platt, the senator who introduced the Platt Amendment, and then the Rough Riders with Theodore Roosevelt in the center, just under the flag, the guy in the suspenders who has no one sitting in front of him. He was the colonel of that regiment. Okay, well, the other side of the world beckoned as well. And we had interests in China. Now, China as a nation was not the kind of nation that was really worked well in that romantic nationalism of European nationhood. Nevertheless, we and the Europeans considered it to be that kind of nation, and we treated it like that kind of nation. The Chinese had been weakened by losing the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Japan had fought China, fought China over control of Manchuria, and had defeated the Chinese in short order. The Japanese are kind of a miracle in the 19th century. They adopted German, French, and U.S. military arrangements and weapons, and then became hyper-aggressive in that area. And in fact, Japanese history is of a piece from the 1890s through the end of World War II. But this isn't a Japanese history class, so we will not deal with that. Anyway, the Sino-Japanese War left China vulnerable and open to the to European powers to establish spheres of influence. And that is, European powers saw that China was weak, would not be able to resist. And so the English, the Germans, the Russians, the French, and the Japanese all set up these trading areas in which China had nominal control, but in fact, China had no control over these trading colonies that the Europeans had set up. These are called spheres of influence. Now, John Hay, the Secretary of State under McKinley, who had also been President Lincoln's personal secretary, then asked for, inaugurated a policy called the open door policy, beginning in 1899, and then he sent letters to European consulates, European basically departments of state, ministers of foreign affairs, saying, well, the U.S. would like, instead of having these spheres of influence which violate Chinese sovereignty, we think there ought to be an open door policy where everybody gets to trade with everybody else. This was just a U.S. counter to the spheres of influence notion that these early birds had gotten. The U.S. was actually kept out of Chinese markets that it wanted to get into, and it was unable to establish its own sphere of influence because all the good ones were taken. And so it just simply wanted to counter with a proposal that said, why don't you guys give up your spheres of influence so we can trade too? And of course, the European powers just more or less just laughed at us. There was some motion in 1900 when Hay unilaterally said, well, I've sent them these letters. They've sent me these nice replies back, which means they agree and they're going to open their doors to U.S. trading, which was absolute hogwash and just bluster on the part of Hayes. It was a big bluff on his part, but that bluff actually went somewhere with the Boxer Rebellion of 1901. Now, this was a flurry of nationalism led by young men in groups known as Societies of Harmonious Fists. They were boxing clubs that were actually military militia. And they rose up with the connivance of the Empress to drive foreigners out of China. And this was a pretty tense time in outposts in particular, places that didn't have regular European military garrisons in them. They were highly exposed, almost like settlers on a frontier. Eventually, the Boxer Rebellion, with pretty serious loss of life on both sides, was put down by European military with U.S. cooperation. And this allowed Hay to push his open door policy that got more agreement from the European nations. This was also the failure of the Boxer Rebellion was the last stand that China had against Western domination until the Nationalist Rebellion of 1912 that overthrew the last of the Ming Dynasty and began to set China up as a modern nation. Now let's look at a map and a cartoon. Here you can see this cartoon on the left in which England, Germany, Russia, France, and Japan are carving up the pie of China while the Chinese stand in the background demanding that they stop ineffectually. And then you can see on the right mapping of the spheres of influence. You can see that Russia has a sphere here in Manchuria. Japan has a sphere in Lower Manchuria. The Germans have a sphere here. That sphere is actually bigger. It took in Beijing eventually. The Brits had a sphere along the Yangtze River. Japan had no little sphere here. France had this sphere down here. Now, what it doesn't show with the French is that they also controlled Indochina, or as we call it, Vietnam. And so where is the U.S. in all of this? Well, they're not there. And so that is what drove the concept of the open door. And you can see from this map, drawing out these spheres of influence as of 1910, that the open door did not really ever get off the ground. Nevertheless, that became U.S. policy. Okay, so we see how the U.S. muscled its way onto the world stage, playing the grand game in its own fashion by pursuing the Spanish-American War, which gave it Cuba, and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And we had designs on China as well, culminating in the open door policy. That ends this lecture, and as always, thank you for your attention.